My name's Benjamin Sullivan. I'm an artist, and it's really nice to be invited to speak at Heatherley's today. I've not actually been here before. I thought I had, but got off the tube. No idea where I was, so I haven't been here before. So today's talk essentially is just going to be in two parts. One about I'm going to talk a bit about working methods and take you through kind of how I approach a portrait. And then secondly, I'm going to look at some examples from the past sort of 10 to 15 years or so and talk a bit in depth about those. So the first slide, this is just to introduce you to how I would approach a portrait. So this is a drawing of Maggie Snowling. So this was a commissioned portrait. She's the president of St John's in Oxford. So this is her official presidential portrait. I always start a portrait with a drawing on paper. This, in one way, so one gets a practice go. So you do a drawing, you look at someone's face, you get to know them, and then you can approach the painting in a secondary manner. So you get two goes, if you were, doing the same person. Also, at some point in my career, I realised that I like drawings, I love drawings, and I realised that all my best drawings were underneath my paintings, which I felt was really depressing, and this, if you're working on the canvas, that's how I used to do. So this was another reason to change to that, this technique. So always when I start a sitting, a drawing, I usually have sittings over 2 days. So I'll be working, say, a Monday and a Tuesday. And I approach the sitting, I go with a number of different papers, this is a kind of buff oatmeal. I'll have a number of colours, different weights, etc. And also all manner of drawing material. And just really decide on the day what I'm going to use in relation to who the person is, what the setting is, and things like that really. Just trying to respond to the actual, what you're seeing in front of you. So this is the initial drawing. The next process is to put this onto a canvas. So I do this by photographing the drawing and putting that file onto something, like Photoshop, and sort of manipulating it to some extent on there. So such things as size. So I'll do the drawing any size, I feel like doing really. And then, on Photoshop, you're kind of resizing. Sometimes making some tweaks to the shape, certain areas you may have got wrong, but less is more with that. Extending the contrast, enhancing the contrast rather, and obviously taking the colour out. I then sort of print out this manipulated file, and you can actually see it here. That's a printout of the drawing. And I do make this underpainting just from the drawing. So I should say, so I transfer the drawing from this file, from this printout, essentially using a homemade transfer paper. So I make one just with tracing paper and crushed up pastel, for example. And that way you can make sort of any colour. So transfer the drawing, then underpaint. I should also say about the canvas, I still sort of make my own canvases. I've tried sort of commercially available ones, but I've never found anything that particularly suits me. So still make canvases. This is a linen, so I go through many different types of linen and make a ground myself. So this would be an egg oil emulsion. So again, it's a very sort of traditional ground, and it's what it says. It's egg and oil, and then any pigment you want. So essentially, I go for a sort of greeny grey. Not too dark actually, and then over this there's a kind of green imprimatura just to make it a bit more green. You can see the sort of terpsy wash here. And then for the underpainting, I'm quite quick really, and I just do it from the drawing, usually with two tones, so Van Dyke brown and white here, and I'm not really mixing at all, so I'm using it quite like watercolour really, in that there's no mixing, so to achieve the various tones, you're thinning down more with turpentine or some kind of solvent like that. So no mixing. And this is really quite quick, you know. I'm always in a rush, and so very often when I'm doing this, the sitting will be the next day, so I'm kind of really sort of desperate to get things finished. So this will be probably after 2 hours or so, in preparation for the sitting tomorrow. The paints I use for this bit are Griffin Alkyd, so I think they're made by Winsor & Newton. They're actually not particularly nice, but they're actually really good for drying quickly, so they're for artists in a rush, you know, basically. The other thing to say, this is part of a much larger canvas that you'll see in a bit, but this essentially is the bit I like to do with the sitter in front of me, because it's also squared up, and things like her torso, you know, the jacket she was wearing, I'll use sort of reference photos for that. So this basically is after the first sitting. I use the underpainting really as a map, just to put the top layer on. I find it really useful just for being quite free. You know, so for this bit, I'm quite sort of broad brushes, large areas of colour, painting in mid-tones for the most part, then extending the light areas and sending back the dark areas, etc. Keeping the darks thin, impastos light, and quite, you know, the light areas for impasto, sorry. So it's really quite a traditional way of working in that regard. I'm not really going to talk about mediums, but I mean, feel free to ask me about that in the questions at the end. Although I did note that for this actually, I was using this kind of wax paste that I actually made at art college, so it's about 25 years old, and I still have some jam jars of it. And it makes a really nice kind of tacky, waxy, buttery kind of finish. It's lovely to use actually. You can get, Michael Harding does a kind of equivalent, which is quite good. And mine's slightly better, I think. So this is kind of developing the structure, modifying the colour. The colours will change, as we know, for people who've done lots of painting from life. The colours change throughout the sitting, the light changes. So I note the cheek has gone from green to red, you know, and it'll probably go back. The net effect of that is that you hope to have all of these colours shining through to some extent. And especially with that's what this wax paste is quite good for. You can kind of drag the thick paint over quite pleasingly, and various colours will come through, is the hope anyway. Second sitting, so this is further development. Make the shadows darker, re-establish the highlights, get in the background tone quite quickly. Third sitting, calm down some areas. So I can remember in this one I had the neck, I had the neck painted rather too, it was just stood out too much. So a thin kind of washy, imprimatura glaze type thing, sent it back, and then you can re-establish the highlights. So I mean, that's just an example of, you know, having a technique but using different methods just to make the painting work. So you have to be adaptable, essentially, is what I'm saying. I've got blocking the body, avoid the temptation to overwork, which is kind of, you know, every artist should have that on their studio door, I think. But I mean, you know, I like to be quite broad brush. I'm not a fan of kind of blending in, and you can see it's left rather loose, I think. You know, the temptation sometimes is to, you know, sort of rework these areas that are quite large brush, but I think if it sits right, then you should leave it. So this is back in the studio, starting to underpaint the structure of the background, return to the setting to paint the background. And, oh yeah, this is, sorry, I've gone ahead. So this is the finished painting. So some of it, well, I will have done in the studio, but areas such as, you know, this massive window here, that was all done in front of the window, etc., etc. So best to do as much as you can, as you know. So I'm just going to move on to another example. So this is called Portrait of an Unknown Man. The title because he was a model I hired for a separate project. and I've kind of finished what I was doing, so I made this drawing with him at the end and sort of really liked it. So I thought, this would be nice as a painting. The actual drawing is tiny, probably about that big. So the reason why I'm showing it employs a slightly different technique in that I decided to use a gesso panel for the painting. I used to do this quite a lot when I was younger, but haven't done so for a while, but I've still got some lying around the studio, so I used one here. This is, traditional gesso, different from kind of acrylic gessos. They're amazing things to work on, so smooth, but very time consuming to make, but can be good fun. So it's initially approached in the same way. I've done a drawing, then transfer that drawing to the gesso panel. So the drawing is photographed, manipulated, and then transferred onto the panel with graphite here instead of pastel. The idea being that the pencil is eventually removed. This is the interesting thing about this technique. So the drawing's transferred here, and then you can see I've started to go over it in watercolour, just essentially going over all the lines. Unlike other oil grounds, gesso will accept watercolour, so you can do the preparatory layers with watercolour. So that's it kind of filled in. Watercolour stage, this stage finished, the face is covered and the suit blocked in. And the next process is to sand it down. So when you sand a gesso panel, you're kind of trying to get this incredibly smooth finish, and you end up sanding with a kind of 1200 wet and dry. It gets this beautiful finish. So when you put the drawing on, what you're trying to do is get rid of the pencil line, because pencil is not that good. It'll show up through oil layers eventually. So you're trying to get rid of the pencil and keep the watercolour. And the really clever thing it does is because it's absorbent surface, the watercolour goes into the ground and the pencil sits on top, so that when you sand, all that should be left is the watercolour. And this is actually very faint. I've probably increased the contrast here just so you can see it a bit better. I've actually missed a stage, I'm afraid, but I'd approach it from here like one did with the previous example, but using watercolour, so doing an underpainting from the drawing using watercolour, but just using something like Van Dyke Brown, obviously because you're painting on white. This is the next picture. So if you can imagine a few layers, a few processes further. So there would have been an underpainting on white, and then I was thinking, crumbs, this is actually too, I so rarely work on white, it was actually too much. So I put this kind of imprimatura layer, this kind of green here. I actually put it on. I have a spray gun and compressor that I use for things like this, because it just sprays such a fine layer of paint. I also use it quite a lot for putting retouch varnish on areas. It's really useful because it's so you can put such a small layer, such a small amount of something on. So I put this layer of green on, and then thought, crumbs, that is really green. And I think, to be honest, I would have changed it, given a bit more time, but I wanted to get on, so I went straight in with the painting. So approaching gesso panels are great for doing very sensitive, really worked, very fine things, but I don't really work like that anymore, so I just approached it with my usual style. This is the sort of finished painting. It's small, the drawing's about that big, but the painting's a wee bit bigger. His face is probably that, so the panel's about that big, I think. And I usually use, normal sort of titanium white, but in this I think I used a bit of lead white just because I wanted quite a bit of texture in there, and you can really see that in the background, I think. You get that look that only lead white gives you. So that's really a bit about technique. I thought I'd just show this one actually, these two, just in terms of how various works can develop. So this is Julian Bingley, a friend of mine. So I painted this in probably 2015-16. again, it was, so I'd have done it in the usual way. So imagine this piece of paper just with a head on, and then I would have been in a rush to do this. I think this was, you know, submitting for a BP Portrait Award one year, so I was in kind of trying to meet that deadline. So did this head, then put that on the computer, and I remember actually with this one thinking his head was a bit too squat, so I actually did on Photoshop, I slightly pulled it just a tiny bit, but I think you can see it's slightly more elongated there. I think it just worked a bit better. So from there, on the painting, I had this head underpainted, and then just drew on the canvas really with charcoal to get the rest of the body and the hands, etc. And then finished this painting probably in about a month, 5 weeks or so. Got it down to London, and then came back to the studio and thought, actually, the drawings were rather good, so, you know, let's see what I can do with that. So I then used the template of the painting to do the rest of the torso of the drawing, which is quite a, you know, I'm showing this because it's an interesting way of showing that, you know, one is a template for one, and then the painting becomes a template for the drawing. So, and I let it, you know, try and lead its own life really, in that I followed some of the structure of the background here, but was able to, you know, decided to change it and put something different in. I didn't want it to be a carbon copy, you know, so that it exists as a work of art in its own right, or at least one hopes so. So move on now to this. This is the All Souls Triptych. So this is probably the biggest thing, well, definitely the biggest thing I've done. This is an oil painting on 3 canvases. Took 3.5 years to do, completed in 2012, exhibited at the Ashmolean. So the story is, this is a view of the college actually, and this is, oh, crumbs. This is actually where the painting ended up, and these are sort of the famous Twin Towers at All Souls, and this is a vestibule area where the painting is to this day. But they approached me with this kind of brief saying, we want this painting of the non-academic staff, would you be interested? There's some sort of 40 individuals, the guidelines were fairly fluid, the intention being that the artist should use their judgment to influence the design of the work. And I was really impressed by the fact that the college were quite insistent that this should be a work of art. That's right. So not a traditional college portrait, and I think I approached it with a different set of values really, because I felt like it could be something larger than, you know, the traditional head of house painting, as we saw in the first set of slides. So the only stipulation, they said, that the portrait should be non-ironic, whatever that means, but that sticks in my mind to this day. So these are some sort of historic Oxford portraits of college staff. This is a kind of quite famous scullion at Christ Church by John Riley. And you know, in every college there's a kind of few of these. And then, of course, right up to more modern times, this is a Daphne Todd at Lincoln College. So I was aware of these kind of these works and the tradition of college portraits of having their servants, as they called them then, painted. So a couple of influences. I was, you know, really into Stan Spencer. He's kind of one of my heroes, and I'd been working on a number of paintings already that were sort of based on some of the compositional elements of his design. I've always had an inclination for Spencer's extended perspective, things like this. And I like the idea of making something with multiple panels so that you could essentially make a more interesting composition that could go across multiple canvases that didn't undermine the kind of compositional elements in one work. So, I mean, this is obviously Sandon Memorial Chapel. And then on this side, this is the Lady Chapel at Campion Hall in Oxford by Charles Marney. Has anyone seen that, actually? It's really, I'm surprised, because it's, I mean, in a way I'm not surprised, but it's kind of really, it's kind of a tucked away college, and they're quite private. It's the Jesuit College in Oxford. So quite a bizarre place, but it really is a quite remarkable thing, similar in some respects to the Memorial Chapel. And in fact, I think Stan Spencer was approached first of all to do this job, but he didn't get on with the Jesuits apparently. But so anyway, this was where I was coming from in the initial stages. So this is the initial design. So this was after a brief visit to the college to get an idea of the workings. I made these kind of studies in watercolour and body colour. They're from kind of lots and lots of photos of models. In fact, that's my mum, that's my dad, that's my wife. So those were the models. And they're all kind of, Dad was furious actually that I got dressed up like that, but they're all kind of aping the kind of jobs that go on at the college. So this was my tender for the job. I like the fact it's a triptych. I've always thought there's a sense of resolution to a triptych that's not kind of quite evident in a, if you think of a diptych, the centre is the middle where the two panels join, but the triptych, you can let your eyes rest in the middle and take on the rest of the composition. So briefly, the left panel was kind of cleaners, scouts, maintenance, etc. The right panel was kind of kitchen, buttery and pantry, and then the centre, kind of administration, the gardener, porters, etc. And this is a kind of outdoor view, again, getting the main quad at All Souls with the sort of famous Codrington Library in the background. Of course, this was in 2008, so what happened then was a massive financial crisis, and I think All Souls lost overnight about £40 million. They subsequently found it again, but I think they got sort of cold feet about the thing I'd mapped out, the sheer size of it, really. So I was a bit deflated by this, but went away and kind of reworked the designs, essentially just chopping them about on Photoshop again, and came up with these two. I was a bit naughty really, because I gave a very sort of unreasonable estimate of how long they'd take to make. I said about 8 months, knowing full well, it's probably about 3 years, which was quite naughty. But I really thought that once I was there and they saw the quality of the work that I hoped to do, they'd kind of go with it, and luckily they did. So in many ways, this was a kind of quite normal, natural reworking anyway. I'd put the kitchen now in the centre, which is a difference to the first one. It's on the side, and anyone who's been to All Souls will know sort of how important food and indeed wine are in that sort of college environment. So this felt a natural reworking anyway. The painting differs substantially from the design, I think. This is because I was actually resident here, so I was relying on, I was using the reality of the situation rather than imagining what might go on in an Oxford college. There was no time to kind of, the time pressure meant that there was no time to prepare a rework design, including these figures. So essentially I just had the canvases made and had to go for it. So it was a case of just starting on this side and going like that, really. Starting with all the foreground figures. And the way I kept the whole composition in check was really creating this kind of arch that goes through the whole, all three canvases, that really sort of had the effect of tying everything in and kind of keeping the composition in at the edges for some reason. So, it was a tricky thing to do, but this is how I kind of kept it all together. I don't want to talk too long about the painting, I'm sort of aware of time, but, I got to know, yeah, it's sort of 3 metres this way, about 3 metres, and that's just under 2 perhaps, and they're all framed together. But, because I was there for 18 months, resident in a college, so I got to know all these people really well, and it was a wonderful sort of uplifting thing, gives you real faith in humanity, because they all had a sort of interesting story to tell. this guy. I used to go drinking with him in a West Oxford pub. This Norma here she'd been there for about 50 years. In fact, these three ladies were all very significant college secretaries that actually retired quite soon after the painting was finished. You've got Miriam here. She was wonderful. She was kind of one of these traditional Oxford families who the whole family had been in kind of college service their entire lives. I think her husband had been a head porter at St John's, and so they brought up their family in a Grace and Favour house on Museum Street, which is a kind of 5 million terrace house these days. And also you've got the new sort of, this was in 2010-11, so the sort of influx of people from Eastern Europe coming in. So Maria Chachula was there were several people there, and she must have been in her early 20s at that time. She was a buttery assistant, and now lovely, if you go back there, she's actually a head porter, and very proud she is as well. I think she was the first head porter at All Souls. So this is a painting I did of a guy called Michel Strauss. I think this was painted in 2016 at his home in Norfolk. He's a sort of really quite well-known art collector, and luckily for me, he sort of collects mine. So I've probably known him for about 10 years. Well, actually, I met him when I was at All Souls because his stepfather was the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, quite interestingly. But he'd spent his, life at Sotheby's, essentially. So this was a great thing to do, to go to his home and paint this portrait. I loved it just because he's got such an amazing face. This is the initial drawing. And he's someone who's quite, he's in his 80s here, and he's always been very comfortable in his own skin. He's very proud of his sort of broken nose that he broke when he was a child. But he said to me, "Ben, have I actually got that many lines in my face?" I said, "Yes, you have." So this is a kind of process shot, which I thought just might be interesting. This is in Michel's home. And it's interesting to see here, actually, so this probably first or second sitting, and I'm kind of, so he would have been sat here, and the painting, obviously, you can see how, I've underpainted it, really very little of it, and I mean, it's far better to, if one can do all the underpainting and then approach the colour, but it's not always, well, never possible for me anyway, just because of time. But I'm also using the printout of the drawing here to refer to as well. So I don't always do that, and I was quite surprised when I came across this photo and saw myself doing that. Perhaps there was something going on that I wasn't quite happy with, so I was referring back to the drawing. A couple of weeks down the line, you can see the hands and face pretty much finished, and I'm starting to work on the clothing. Again, so this is kind of underpainted, and often what I do so these trousers, I would have underpainted them like this, and then put a kind of imprimatura wash on, just a terpsy wash, to get a colour that kind of relates to the top coat, but isn't the top coat. So I think I used a kind of ready, well, let's see. Yeah, it's a kind of reddy orange, and then went over in a very sort of thin coat with this green. So you get this really lovely effect of the underpainting, the kind of orange-red coming through the green. It makes a nice kind of optical effect, and can have also the effect of explaining to some extent the material you're trying to paint. So this is the finished painting again. I spent quite a lot of time in Norfolk with this. He was great, actually, because it's always trouble getting people to sit for long enough times for the correct amount of time. But Michel was really into it, so he sat for literally days on end. I'd go up there and I said, "Well, we'll try and do 2 or 3 hours," and he'd actually sit for a whole day. So I think that really pays off. You enjoy it more, and really you get much more out of it. Most of the background was painted in Norfolk, and then things like I remember borrowing that rug and took that back to Suffolk to paint. And also there's a couple of exhibition catalogues from Michel's sort of Sotheby's days, which, books in paintings, it's a bit of a cliche, but sometimes it works. you know, and I quite like the idea of it here. So that's still life. You know, I would have taken these books back to Suffolk, and that was actually painted in my studio in Suffolk. So move on now to, this is an elderly lady who lives near Eton. So this was commissioned by the RAF Club to mark their centenary, so it was last year. It was done at the drawing room in Windsor Castle. The painting was largely based on photographs, as she was only able to offer one sitting. And so I thought I'd show this as an example of what can happen. So I stipulated at the start, you know, it'd be great to have, I understand you can't sit for the requisite amount, but could you manage 4? And the word came back from the palace that yes, she could. And then kind of a year down the line, it actually transpired that she'd do 1. So it was a bit disappointing, but it means essentially you do what you can with what you're given. And this is a kind of example of that. So I had an hour and 20 minutes with her. Then I made some drawings at the sitting, but if you can imagine it's such a, when you first meet someone, it's you're kind of trying to put each other at ease, so you're chatting. So it wasn't really possible in that hour or so to get too much done. So that's why I took so many photos. This is a study that I did. I made sure I stayed in Windsor in a hotel, and I did this study from a photo that I quite liked, but I did this thing of having a laptop and actually putting it over there and then standing back from it and just trying to remember, remember as much as I could what happened in the sitting in order to inform the colour. So it was actually quite important to stay, I kind of locked myself up in this hotel room and just did this. I actually felt that I had her posed 2 ways, and this one actually made her look quite cross. I think she was actually looking out the window, and she was a bit furious that her roses had been pruned far too early. So I turned around and she cheered up. So this is the position I chose, and I did this kind of study. I wouldn't have normally done something like this, but I think I was so concerned that the fact that I had so little time with her, that I was really eager to work things through before I actually approached the canvas. So this is study 2. This is the chosen position on buff paper, watercolour and body colour. It was actually quite useful because I changed a few things, including the actual shape of the final canvas. I'd made a wee bit taller. Changed the background. I tweaked the angle of the chair and made the legs much smaller, because that's one of the problems with photos, is it sends everything out and they look far too big here. But it was quite a useful exercise. So there are just some process shots here which I thought might be interesting. So this is the underpainting, and you can see I was talking about imprimatur layers over the underpainting. So I've used kind of green for the hands and face, which is good for skin tones. Kind of orangey again, like Michel's trousers. I've used an orange here. And then I painted over with a very sort of really scumbled, quite thick paint. So you can actually see the orange shining through, and it's quite, optically again quite pleasing, but it's also quite good in describing the actual material of the dress he was wearing. So that's a group crit with my daughter. And then I did actually go back to Windsor. They said I could go back and, see the background again. So I actually went back to paint the chair, because this, as you can imagine, this was a bit of a nightmare painting it. And that's just a detail of the final painting. So this is Breech. So this is a portrait of my wife and daughter at 8 months old. Obviously this won the BP in 2017. It was painted quickly, in around 4 weeks. Which is quick for me. It was a period when a sort of sense of calm descended after the the hiatus of having a child. I guess it happens to all parents. But it was a really nice time for the 3 of us to sort of bond and sit together after a rather hectic few months. I love the sort of the idea of the bond between mother and child, you know, and it's set in this my studio, this realistic space, and there they are, sort of oblivious to the viewer. So this would have been the initial preliminary drawing. When I started, actually, I had no idea if it would be possible to do, because she was, you know, you think a baby, they're not going to sit still. But actually, it went far better than I had hoped for, and we really used, or Ginny used, you know, in those moments when she roused, Ginny would nurse her back to sleep. And so it's important to say, actually, that the concept was never as a breastfeeding portrait, but this is what happens to obviously calm your child down. So this is a process shot, probably halfway through. You can see I actually did a very sort of detailed underpainting here, and for once I managed to actually finish it before I actually started the overpainting, which is very unusual for me. But again, you know, I would have put an imprimatur over of a very sort of light green, and this was really nice to paint on. I remember just really enjoying it. Forgive the family shot, but this is kind of what could happen at other times. So I think this is when I was doing her face, because she's obviously wearing clothes, and she perhaps would have done half an hour and then woken up and gone, oh, there's Dada. So I'm really just going to finish on the power of art, because the great thing about this painting really is how it's been, you can't actually read the text here, but you can't, but how this painting has been used since it was in the press. You know, Ginny, my wife, got really sort of on board with the whole normalising breastfeeding campaign. And indeed, the BP Portrait Award, when it toured that year, she organised sort of breastfeeding sit-ins at all the major venues. And has since then, you know, started up and runs a peer-to-peer support network in our town. And also this painting has been used in various sort of UNICEF campaigns to normalise breastfeeding. And this is a current book that's just been published that's a resource for schools, again, to normalise breastfeeding. So you know, it's nothing to do with me, but I think it's wonderful. And the author here is, I think she's been very canny, actually, in putting it next to this kind of very sort of romanticised view of breastfeeding. And this kind of, the questions kind of relate to that as well. Just the last one, actually, is this one I've just done, which is just kind of an update, really. This is called Two Artists. It's obvious why, really. This is what happens 2 years later, much to my amazement. And this is me in the mirror. But I'll sort of end there, and by all means, ask any questions. This one. It's actually a pretty similar size to Breech, so it's probably about that. I'm always really drawn to this kind of format of long and thin. I don't know why, but you know, the Queen was quite long and thin, Michel Strauss is long and thin, Breech was, and then this. I don't really know why, but I keep on doing canvases of this shape. And I mean, Michel Strauss was quite big. Sorry, you know, probably about that, but this is much smaller, probably about that, yeah. Mm. The Queen, she's quite large, actually. The Queen, I mean, they you know, it was meant to go in a certain space, so it had to be a certain size, so it was about this large, I think, yeah. In here, to be honest, I mean, the way it started was, Ginny said, oh, will you look after Edie for the afternoon? And I said, yeah, okay, with an ulterior motive. And she came back and I go, look, I've started a painting. But yeah, I kind of set her up in the studio with some paints, and I'd set my easel up already, and I just thought, I'll see how it goes. And to be honest, she didn't sit long there, but I started the drawing and got enough on the paper that I felt there was something there I could proceed with. So I also took, you know, a load of images of this as well.
So you took a lot of photographs?
Yeah.
As well?
Yeah. So yeah, I'd find it very difficult to start, like with the one of the Queen, to start with just a photograph in front of you. I find that really difficult, just because it's very boring. But sometimes you have to do it. But this was better because, you know, I was able to start the drawing with her sat there, you know, she was directly below me. And then because I felt I had some kind of intimacy with the scene and my piece of paper and the thing going on in front of me, I felt kind of confident to proceed, you know, with some reference to photographs as well. Yeah.
With the extended perspective thing that you're doing with the Oxford's portraits, sort of how, I mean, there was some figures sort of close by that you actually stood on something logistically. How do you?
No, you see, it's always something I've done quite naturally. You see, this is the curious thing, and I remember sort of visiting an ophthalmologist a few years ago. I've actually got one lazy eye, you see, and he said to me, "Oh, you've probably got a really strange sense of perspective," and I thought, that probably explains something. But so it might be something to do with that. I've always been in a very small studio, so practically that means you're quite near the person, and if there's a person there, if you imagine, you do have to change your viewpoint to look at his feet and his hands, so you're naturally changing the perspective just by moving your head sort of up and down.
And were you doing them each sort of separately? They were sitting for you and...
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, sorry, I didn't explain that, but they actually all came to sit individually. So that was one of the quite difficult things to work that all out, really. Yeah.
Referring back to the number of lines Michel Strauss complained about, do you tend to paint? I would feel you paint it as it is, without being tempted to flatter the sitter. How do you set up to make them look a bit better?
Yeah, I mean, I don't get involved in flattery at all, because I just think once you go down that road, where do you stop? That's the kind of thing I've always thought. And exaggeration, I think you should err on the side of exaggeration rather than beautifying. So essentially, if a guy's got a big nose, I do make it a bit bigger. You know, if someone's got big ears, etc. But I mean, carefully, I would say. Exactly. Yeah, and it's a fine line. Yeah.
Why do you when you showed us some faces that you drawn earlier? You said you drew them at about a finger thumb size. Why don't you draw them at full size, or the size that you're going to put on the canvas?
I think because often I haven't decided what size the canvas will be. So when I do the drawing, all I'm thinking about is responding to what's in front of me. So I'm just making the drawing I want to make. So sometimes it'll be influenced by the paper, sometimes it'll be influenced by the drawing material. For instance, if I'm doing a pencil drawing, I think that they work really well in quite small. So with a pencil, I tend to go quite small. If I'm using compressed charcoal or something, I might tend to go a wee bit bigger. So it can just be all down to what one fancies on the day, really.
Working with you've taken pictures of your subjects for quite a while, because I know obviously in school we're so encouraged to do from life. So did you just buck the system and say I'm taking a picture?
No, I mean I'd sort of go along with that, really, but the reality is, you have to work with what's available to you. And I mean, a good deal of this is from life, although, because the idea was, I was going to draw Edie, use a bit of reference material for that, and then I could just do everything else from being sat in front of it. But when I sort of looked at myself in the mirror, and because it's a mirror, so I was looking out at the viewer, and I just thought the concept of that actually looked quite wrong. Because if you were there with your daughter and you were kind of looking at the viewer and not at your daughter, it just had the wrong kind of feel. So in the actual painting, I'm looking down at her. So I had to, the face was done, well, at least sketched in there from that reference, and then you can proceed with looking in the mirror.
slightly aside from yours, are most self-portraits through the world mirror images, or no?
I don't know actually. I mean, that's an interesting point because of course you're looking at yourself the wrong way around. You know, the other way from people, how people view you, but it is the way you see yourself in a mirror. So I mean, if you change it round, it is actually quite different. So I don't know. Is the honest answer. Yeah.
Well, in glazed lens, what do you think about how people?
I do a bit of both. I mean, like lots of people kind of, I use all manner really. So I do use glazing some areas, but I also use quite thick alla prima at other times as well. So, I do try to be quite quick. So when I'm doing the overpainting in a portrait, I'll try and get it done, in a few days and really then not. The temptation is to always go back to it, but I try not to, although you're quite right, sometimes one does sort of go back in, and especially things like glazing areas, making them a bit darker, that does happen quite a bit, yeah.
Excuse me, when you had the picture paint the Queen, was it the RAF Club that asked the Queen whether they could get a portrait, or was it you that asked the Queen and said, I've got to paint with the RAF Club? I just wondered how you got the introduction.
Yeah, so the RAF Club sorted that all out. I think they'd actually approached, I think the way it happens is that the client approaches the palace before, just to make sure that she would be amenable. Really.
Obviously you've established yourself as a portrait painter now and one P and everything, but I assume these are all sort of paintings from the last 10 years. How did you find establishing yourself as a portrait painter? Did you always paint portraits? What about the period in 5 years post leaving uni? I think you were at Edinburgh. To those of us still at art school about to leave, what would you say? What advice would you give?
I mean, the BP was in my sort of life outside of college, graduated in 2000, the BP was the thing, there's no other way to put it really. So that was kind of where you aimed all your resources. But I mean, just any, all open exhibitions that, that are focused on that would perhaps be receptive to the kind of work I was making. I just kind of tried to do everything I possibly could. I suppose I was lucky and I got a couple of decent commissions from after art school, and the way it works is if you do a good one and then other people see it, then you get more work that way, and that really is how it works.
So just paint and paint and paint.
Yeah.
And apply.
I think so. Yeah. Don't be too disappointed with knockbacks as well. That's a really good bit of advice to. Yeah.